The Cold War was not a traditional war of direct military conflict, but a geopolitical, ideological, and economic struggle that lasted for more than 4 decades. Fought mainly between the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies, it shaped global alliances, incited proxy wars, and introduced the constant fear of nuclear annihilation. Beginning shortly after World War II and lasting until the early 1990s, the Cold War defined international relations, transformed political ideologies, and influenced technological advancement. It was a war of threats, espionage, propaganda, and competition for global influence. Origins of the Cold War. The end of World War II. The seeds of the Cold War were sown during the final stages of World War II. Though the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union were allies against Nazi Germany, their relationship was uneasy. The Yalta Conference, February 1945, and the Potsdam Conference, July 1945, exposed ideological tensions. While the Western powers wanted to promote democracy and rebuild Europe under capitalism, Joseph Stalin sought to expand Soviet influence and spread communism. Ideological differences. At its core, the Cold War was a clash of ideologies. The United States championed capitalism, liberal democracy, and a free market economy, while the Soviet Union supported communism, a state-controlled economy, and a one-party system. These opposing worldviews led to mutual distrust and growing competition. The Iron Curtain and Containment Policy. By 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, symbolizing the division between Communist East and Capitalist West. In response, the United States adopted the policy of containment, aimed at preventing the spread of communism beyond its existing borders. This strategy laid the foundation for American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to countries resisting communist subjugation, notably Greece and Turkey. The following year, the Marshall Plan provided over $13 billion in economic aid to rebuild war-torn Europe and prevent the rise of communism in economically vulnerable countries. The Soviet Union, viewing these actions as attempts to undermine its influence, refused aid and pressured Eastern European countries to do the same. Formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In 1949, the United States and its allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as a mutual defense pact. The Soviet Union responded in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact, aligning its Eastern European allies in a similar military alliance. These alliances cemented the division of Europe into hostile blocs. Major Cold War crises. The Berlin blockade and airlift, 1948 to 1949. In one of the first major confrontations of the Cold War, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin in an attempt to force the Western Allies out. The US and its allies responded with a massive airlift, supplying the city for nearly a year until the Soviets lifted the blockade. The crisis underscored the West's commitment to resisting Soviet pressure. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The Cold War turned hot in Korea when Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. Backed by China and the Soviet Union, the North was countered by United Nations forces led by the United States. The war ended in a stalemate, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel. It marked the first armed conflict in the Cold War and reinforced the U.S. commitment to containment. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Perhaps the most dangerous Cold War confrontation occurred when the U.S. discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. After a tense 13-day standoff, during which the world stood on the brink of nuclear war, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. The crisis highlighted the devastating potential of nuclear war and led to efforts to improve communication, such as the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline, the arms race and nuclear deterrence. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union engaged in a massive arms race, building vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, dictated that neither side would initiate a nuclear conflict because both would face complete annihilation. Despite the terror it inspired, MAD arguably prevented direct conflict between the superpowers. Space race. Parallel to the arms race was the space race, a technological competition symbolizing national prestige and ideological superiority. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, shocking the US and sparking major investments in science and education. The US responded by landing the first humans on the moon in 1969, marking a symbolic Cold War victory. Global Cold War. Beyond Europe and North America, the Cold War was not limited to Europe or the superpowers themselves. It became a global conflict, influencing events in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam was another attempt to prevent the spread of communism. After years of brutal conflict, heavy casualties, and rising domestic opposition, the U.S. withdrew, and South Vietnam fell to communist forces. The war deeply scarred American society and raised questions about the limits of containment. Latin America and Africa. The Cold War shaped numerous coups, revolutions, and proxy wars in the developing world. The U.S. supported anti-communist regimes and rebels, such as in Chile, 1973, Nicaragua, and Angola. The Soviet Union, in turn, supported leftist movements and governments. These conflicts often resulted in long-term instability and suffering for the countries involved. Détente and renewed tensions. Détente, 1969 to 1979. During the 1970s, both superpowers pursued a policy of détente, a relaxation of tensions. Agreements such as SALT I, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, aimed to curb the arms race. U.S. President Nixon's visit to China and the Soviet Union reflected a shift towards diplomacy and coexistence. Renewed hostilities. Détente collapsed with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The U.S., under President Jimmy Carter and later Ronald Reagan, adopted a more confrontational stance. Reagan increased military spending, called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and supported anti-communist movements worldwide. The end of the Cold War. Gorbachev's reforms. The turning point came with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. Recognizing the stagnation of the Soviet economy and the unsustainable arms race, Gorbachev introduced reforms: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He also sought to reduce tensions with the West, signing arms control agreements and withdrawing from Afghanistan. Eastern Europe revolutions, 1989. As Gorbachev loosened Soviet control, Eastern European countries began to overthrow their communist regimes. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the collapse of Soviet influence. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania transitioned to democracy. Dissolution of the Soviet Union, 1991. Amid growing internal unrest, economic hardship, and demands for independence from republics, the Soviet Union officially dissolved in December 1991. The Cold War ended with the United States as the world's sole superpower, and the global ideological divide appeared to recede. Consequences and legacy. Political and military impact. The Cold War reshaped global alliances, led to the creation of powerful military institutions like NATO, and resulted in numerous conflicts and regime changes. It created a bipolar world order and a perpetual state of military readiness. Nuclear proliferation. The development and spread of nuclear weapons became one of the most alarming aspects of the Cold War. Even after its end, the legacy of nuclear deterrence continues to shape military strategy and global security policies. Economic and cultural influence. The Cold War influenced global economic policies, with the U.S. promoting free market capitalism through institutions like the World Bank and IMF. It also shaped culture, education, technology, and propaganda in both the East and West. Human cost. Millions died in proxy wars and authoritarian regimes supported by either side. The conflict fueled repression, censorship, and human rights abuses across the globe, from Soviet gulags to Latin American death squads. Conclusion. The Cold War was a defining feature of the 20th century, a complex struggle that influenced every corner of the world. Though it never escalated into full-scale global war, its ideological battles, proxy conflicts, and nuclear brinkmanship profoundly affected international relations and domestic policies. Its end marked a major shift in global power dynamics, leading to a unipolar world dominated by the United States. However, the Cold War's legacy remains embedded in geopolitics, military strategies, and international institutions today. Understanding its history is essential to comprehending the modern world and preventing the recurrence of such global tensions in the future.